Bali Maharaj, who was almost killed, or actually killed, um, Bali Maharaj uh, was able to be revived by his guru. And then he became very loyal and went through extensive training. And the training he was doing gave him weapons and a chariot that were virtually invincible. Now, we see in the modern days the same mentality is there. During World War II, both America and Germany figured out that Einstein was right. A tiny bit of matter has a huge amount of energy in it. And no one had ever figured out nuclear energy. But Einstein predicted it. And he wrote a letter to President Roosevelt that you ought to be aware of this. Because if Germany had the nuclear bomb first and had dropped one bomb on London, the war would have been over. London would have surrendered, just as Japan surrendered when a bomb was dropped. I had a professor of mine. I went back to graduate school for some courses about a dozen years ago. And I had this very old professor of mine. He was a captain in the Air Force based in the Pacific. And he would pick bombing sites for the American bombers who were bombing Japan at that time. And the general, Germany had surrendered. The Japanese, huge amount of lives were lost just to get an island like Okinawa or Iwo Jima. Huge amount of American soldiers were lost because the Japanese fought till the last man died. And they're ferocious fighters, and because they were so loyal to the emperor. So what happened? The Americans realized it would take another year of war. This was in August of 1945. It would take another year to invade and defeat the Japanese. So one day the general goes up to the professor and says to him, Mr. Bartley, this war is going to end soon. And the Captain Bartley said, impossible, sir. He says, oh, don't worry, because it was a secret that only the general and those above him knew. And he said, I need 2 more bombing targets. He said, and they picked targets based on weather and industrial capacity for Japan. There's various criteria. One of the criteria was not would civilians be hurt. So the professor said, well, okay. And he came back with 2 targets, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And a 3rd target. And the 3rd target had bad weather, so it wasn't bombed. Because the pilots needed, they didn't have the modern navigation or GPS, so they needed visual coordinates. And of course, it was bombed and the war ended. So there's this competition even nowadays to have the most powerful weapon. The idea is if I have a more powerful weapon, I'll win. We find on the streets, I'm an advisor to the police department here in town. And we find the police are often by criminal gangs, not ordinary citizens, are not armed as well. The ordinary citizens have illegal machine guns, and the police just have generally their pistols. So this mentality that if I have a bigger weapon than your weapon, I can win the war, and I have better prowess than you do. This mentality is long-standing. We have it now. We had it in World War II. And of course, we had it with Bali Maharaj. So Bali Maharaj approaches the city. And when he approaches the city, Indra goes to his spiritual master, Prishupati, and says, "Ah!" Well, maybe he didn't exactly say it that way, but that would be the modern way of saying it. What do I do? This army is coming, and they're more powerful than us. And he gave a good advice. It was the same advice a colleague of mine gave me in the 70s. In the 70s, I was going to Rutgers University in Newark, and I was doing my thesis. So I had every night late in the laboratory, and between Rutgers and the train station was a very bad neighborhood, crime-ridden ghetto neighborhood. And every night I'd have to take the last train. And so I'd have to walk through this neighborhood, and there was a lot of racial tension, and I was considered the enemy due to my race. So, and getting it, once I got to the train station, I was safe. There was a policeman there, but I had to walk this 3/4 of a mile through this horrible neighborhood in the dark alone. So one of my colleagues gave me some good advice. Can you guess what the advice he gave me was? He said, when they're coming after you, run, run, run. And I learned to run very quickly. Sometimes the objects would be flowing past my head, but they never caught me. So similarly, the mentality is the same. What I'm trying to show is a mentality that we're reading the Bhagavatam. We can see all the same psychology nowadays. Might not be as dramatic, but it's there. So what was the advice that was given to Bali Maharaj? To Indra? Run, run, run. Now, these are very high-level demigods. Nobody was lusty or greedy, even though it was the most beautiful women in the universe, the most handsome men in the universe. People weren't lusty, they weren't greedy. There was wealth all around, but they were high-class, elevated people. Along with that, they had certain skills. And one of the skills was to change their form and even become invisible. So that's what they did. And they ran before the army got there. And then Bali didn't even have to fight. He just had to walk in the city and sit on Indra's throne and conquer. So, in the first verse, neither you, he's here, Bali Maharaj is getting advice from Vishupati. Neither you nor your men can conquer the most powerful Bali. Indeed, no one but the Supreme Personality of Godhead can conquer him, for he is now equipped with the supreme spiritual power, Brahma Tejas. As no one can stand before Yamraj, no one can now stand before Bali Maharaj. Analogy clear. You go in front of Yamraj and say, can I have 5 more minutes? We just had a Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was, for those who know something about her life, a quite admirable life, very, very high-class person, very super intelligent. And she did not want the current president to pick her successor. So she's working even till a day before she died, reading briefs, but she has pancreatic cancer and is dying. And she gave her last dying wish. She said, let me live long enough so the next president will pick my successor. And with all her fame and all her fortune and the best doctors in the world, they couldn't extend her. She wanted one more month at least, and they had no way to do it. So no matter how powerful we are, we can't hardly beg one more day. And Sangeeta, who is this amazing devotee who, with the greatest compassion, deals with issues at the time of death and helps devotees at the time of death. She reports she's seen so many devotees pass on. And she was asked, when a devotee is dying, what's the most common thing they say? Think about it a minute. What is the most common thing devotees say when they're about to die? Or maybe not the moment of death, but death is imminent. Think about it for a moment. Can anybody like to unmute and tell me what they think that is?
Hare Krishna?
Yeah, no. They have one lament. What is lament? It's most common. The most common lament devotees have when they're near death. Same one I'll have.
Srila Prabhupada asked his godbrothers to forgive his offenses.
Many devotees do that. But that is not what she reports. Yeah, somebody writes, I wish I'd remembered Krishna more. That's pretty close. The specific lament is just very similar to that. Yamuna Jaya has commented, very similar. Specific lament is, wish I hadn't wasted so much time on frivolous activities. Wish I'd been, in other words, wish I'd had a better sadhana. Wish I had focused more on Krishna and not so much on watching this movie or talking this gibberish or whatever. That's the biggest lament. So back to the story here. Now, Vishupati then tells he tells him, first he says, you can't conquer these men. Then he says, therefore, waiting until the situation of your enemies is reversed, you should all leave this heavenly place and go elsewhere where you will not be seen. And I'll read the final verse. Esha vipra balo darak samprati ujita vikrama tesamiva pimanina sanubando vinakshati. Bali Maharaj has now become extremely powerful because of the benedictions given by the Brahmins. But when he later insults the Brahmins, he'll be vanquished along with his friends and enemies. Now, that insult, as you'll see later on, was he ignored the advice of his spiritual master and surrendered to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So the insult of the Brahmins, generally, we try not to insult Brahmins, but Bali Maharaj, who was a grandson of Prahlad, ignored the orders of his guru and surrendered to Vamandev. And that will come 2 chapters later. So, what are we trying to learn here? I'm going to read another verse or two because they're quite relevant. Sukadev Goswami is telling the story, and he says, the demigods, being thus advised by Vrishupati, immediately accept his words, assuming forms according to their desire. They can do that. They left the heavenly kingdom and scattered without being observed by the demons. When the demigods had disappeared, Bali Maharaj, the son of Virochan, entered the heavenly kingdom, and from there he brought the three worlds under his control. The Brahmin descendants of Brigu, who had blessed Bali Maharaj, being very pleased with their disciple, who had conquered the entire universe, now engaged in performing 100 Ashvamedha sacrifices. So, because of the flavor of the Brahmins, the great soul Bali, thinking himself very satisfied, became very opulent and prosperous and began to enjoy the kingdom. Now, this raises some interesting questions. At least it raises it for me. And first question that comes to my mind is, gosh, it's really dangerous to insult Brahmins. Because here we read that Bali insulted Brahmins and lost everything. And because of the favor of the Brahmins, Bali got everything. So what does that mean in our practical life that we don't insult Brahmins? And you notice later on, Sukadev Goswami is saying Bali did insult Brahmins. So in our lives, when should we be insulting Brahmins and when should we not be insulting Brahmins? That is an interesting question. So I work for the GBC Executive Committee. They assign me difficult ISKCON resolved cases because I've had 20 years of training. I'm certainly not God's gift of mediation. After 20 years of training, I know something. And so they assign me these difficult cases to work on. They've just given me one that I'm doing with Raj Bihari that's so difficult. It's been going on for years, and there's multi-party dispute. And Raj Bihari had the very clever idea. He said, let us call up senior devotees who were present when Prabhupada was present and ask them this question. When you have circumstances similar to what we're dealing with, accusations of misappropriation of money, things like this, how did Prabhupada deal with it? So we've called up a half a dozen devotees who were intimately involved with Prabhupada and asked this question. And we find the answers very interesting. Because how, when a devotee, especially one of our leaders, is engaged in activities that are very strange, but they're in the Brahminical position, being a spiritual guide for a community, yet they're having their own difficulties. How did Prabhupada deal with it? Well, what we will do is we will maybe, just to make the class a little more interesting, can I post a poll? Am I allowed to do that? Do we have that capability?
We can unmute everyone if you need.
Unmute. You don't have the poll on here where I post a poll and people check?
I think our Zoom account is not having those.
Oh, okay.
Those
Well, let us unmute everyone and have a little discussion for a few minutes.
Yeah.
I'll give you a circumstance.
Daniel, can you help unmute?
Yeah, everyone can unmute themselves if you like. somebody is caught. We'll give a few circumstances. First, someone is caught stealing money from the temple. What would Prabhupada do? Would he get him arrested? Would he just look the other way? What would Prabhupada do?
Close that door, please.
Adi,
Well, Srila Prabhupada, it's interesting, always found it interesting that Srila Prabhupada was more concerned about the devotee than the Lakshmi. And he would offer information to that devotee. If you do this, there'll be a reaction. We're concerned for you,
Yeah.
that you will suffer. Please don't do this.
okay? And he did something else. You're right. The overwhelming majority of times, with one exception, which was very unusual, that's what Prabhupada did. Maybe two exceptions. And somebody else have an idea. What else did Prabhupada do when some leader was caught, in some cases, doing illicit activity, another case, not chanting any rounds, another case, taking money, another case, right in New York, offering, the wife of the leader was offering unofferable substances, the word vegetarian, Jaradiko Vinda. What did Prabhupada do? Any other comments? When just think, and there's no wrong answer, and you can type it or you can unmute. But what would Prabhupada do? He did one other thing. Generally, the answer was Prabhupada looked forward, not backwards. Okay, you've made a terrible mistake. How are you going to stay in devotional service now? He was very concerned about the person. As Ram Baru puts it so brilliantly, Prabhupada was a radical personalist, truly a radical personalist. So he cared about the person. So what else did Prabhupada do? Think about it in your own. You're caught. Here you are in your brahmacharya ashram, and you open your locker, and out drops a bottle of liquor because you were taking little nips at night. And somebody sees it. What would you do if that came out of the locker next to you? Well, any kind of a circumstance you want to imagine. Yamuna Jaya says, did he question himself, asking what more could he have done to help guide this devotee? Generally not. That's a good way to put it. I also thought like that. But Prabhupada was always guiding the devotees, and devotees still have their independent choice. And every one of us is capable every day of making wrong choices. Because if we're not capable of making wrong choices, we don't have freedom. If we don't have freedom, we can't choose. And if we can't choose, there's no love without choice. So we all have that freedom to be stupid. Okay, so what else did Prabhupada do? Think for a moment. He did something else. I'll give a hint. He did something else for that devotee. And he did this almost every time, except one time. And I can tell that story.
Hare Krishna.
Yes.
Prabhupada would take this devotee to travel with him a little bit.
Sometimes he would do it. Let's assume it was a devotee already traveling with Prabhupada, which had happened. But that's a good answer. Very, very good. He would take the devotee and say, just stay with me. And he did that a lot. That's a very good answer. Now let me
And I
go
have
on.
another thought, Prabhu, if I may.
Oh, please.
Prabhupada would never allow other devotees to go public with this and shame the devotee and discuss this and judge. He would prohibit that. That's another thing I thought.
Exactly the answer I was looking for. Well done. Well done. Exactly the answer. Prabhupada would generally try to preserve that devotee's dignity. One time, Prabhupada was, I believe it was Denver, and he walked past the ashram, and one sannyasi was having some spiritual troubles. And Prabhupada heard the brahmacharis gossiping, and he was so furious because he said, now he can't come back. What verse in the Gita talks about this?
Apichet sudaracharo bhajite mamananyabak sadhureva samantavya somya vyavasito hisa. Even if one commits.
Yeah, even if one commits some most abominable activities. That verse talks about the attitude, but it doesn't talk about the specific issue you brought up about preserving dignity. There's another verse that talks about that. And you're right. That verse you quoted, Pichetsu Dachro, is extremely relevant. But there's another verse that's even more specific.
Is that about the speech, Prabhu, nature of speech?
The nature of speech is there, but there's in the early part of the Gita, I don't remember the verse number. Prabhupada says, or the Gita's Krishna says, for one who has been honored, dishonored, he's speaking to Arjuna, chastising, is worse than death, especially for one's a very big leader. So as Ananda Bihari said, Prabhupada would try to preserve the dignity of the devotee. And he did his best to do that. Now, there was one time Prabhupada did differently. Prabhupada had a Sanskrit secretary. And the Sanskrit secretary knew Sanskrit and Bengali. Smart American fellow. He had learned the languages, difficult in such a short time. So a very smart fellow, especially somebody not from India, familiar with the native languages. And he was Prabhupada's Sanskrit secretary. And Prabhupada came to know he was looking at books he shouldn't look at. So Prabhupada told him, don't read these books. They're very, very nasty books. And these were books by critics of Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. There was those so-called Vaishnavas who were like caste Brahmins, and they criticized Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, that he was not bona fide initiated because Gaur Kishore Das Babaji wasn't bona fide, just some silly technical detail that probably wasn't even true. But when people are envious, they'll do the stupidest things. And so he stole some money. He was given money to go shopping for some books, took the money, went to Radhakund, hung out with some envious Babajis, and started preaching to devotees that Prabhupada was not a bona fide guru because Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati wasn't bona fide, because Gaur Kishore Das Babaji, for whatever silly reason, wasn't bona fide. So in this case, Prabhupada did something he only did once that I could research. He sent out a letter to the temples. So-and-so has become an envious snake, a black snake. Avoid his association. Because remember, the movement was so young. You know, devotees were, the average age was probably 21. Very impressionable. And when you have somebody who's the intimate secretary of Prabhupada coming out blaspheming, it can be very damaging. So Prabhupada warned the devotees. In that case, Prabhupada took the extraordinary effort to protect the devotees. And sometimes leaders have to take extraordinary efforts. Somebody who's doing a lot of gossiping, a lot of criticizing, they may actually have to tell them you have to leave, you can't stay anymore. It requires a certain intelligence and discretion to make these decisions. What most people don't know is later on, Prabhupada told them all was forgiven. You can come back and be with me again. The devotee chose not to. It's a huge amount of pride. Even to this day, he still has that pride. He could not come back in association with devotees due to his huge self-pride. A very miserable position to be in. But Prabhupada then invited him, you can come as devotee had suggested before and travel with me again. But he couldn't swallow his ego to do it. But that was an exception where Prabhupada actually hurt his reputation only because it required to protect his movement. So generally, the attitude we're getting from Prabhupada is to be very liberal. If somebody has trouble, the last thing to do is embarrass them publicly, because then they'll go away. And very few of us can withstand that. We all have a little bit of false ego, at least for myself, I can say it's there. I mean, sometimes I'm criticized heavily for things that I didn't even do when I've been in position of leadership. I had nothing to do with it. I couldn't have had anything to do with it. But somebody criticizes and it hurts. I can feel the pain. So I know that we all have that little bit, most of us have that little bit of pride. So Prabhupada wanted to preserve our dignity. That is very important. At the same time, if it was necessary to protect the movement, he would do it. We went through this some years ago at the Bhakti Center. We had a president of the center, a very nice gentleman devotee. And he was very good with numbers, not so good with people. And some management decisions were making that weren't good for the project. So our board of directors met, and Radhanath Swami was there with us. And he was there. And we discussed a certain management decision. And the whole board voted one way. Radhanath Swami is technically not on the board, but the Acharya. He agreed with the board. And so this one devotee then was the outlier. A very sweet devotee. So what did we do then? So he said he felt he should resign because he didn't have the trust of the board. So we kept this very confidential. The board delegated me to sit with him. I was very friendly with him. I still am. And I said, what do you think Krishna is telling you? And it takes us back to the Bali Maharaj story. Of course, in here, Vishupati is saying to Bali Maharaj, previous verse, well, it's actually later on. He says, in the purport, Prabhupada talks about how the only thing the demigods could do at this point is depend on Krishna. And they prayed and prayed. And an incarnation, the dwarf incarnation, Vamandev came. So similarly, I said to this devotee, I said, okay, what does Krishna really want? And I tried to bring him to the place. And he admitted he had a very unhappy wife in the city. And it was weighing more and more on him. And he wanted to be in a different place. And he said, and we just talked and he understood it was the will of Krishna, but we wouldn't let his pride be smashed. And then with the board sanction, I said, well, what do you need to help you transition in a nice way out of this position. So, well, I need X dollars would help me because I'm going to have to rent a place elsewhere, get a car and move. So I said, I'll get back to you shortly. Went back to the board and we gave him $2X because he'd done so much service. And we wanted to be liberal at giving him what he needed to do it. So even though he had made some serious management mistakes, he never wasn't stealing any money or anything at all like that, but he had made some mistakes. The attitude was, what can we do to preserve his devotional service, to keep his dignity, to allow him to move on in a nice way? What more so when a devotee has difficulty? He has difficulty with one of the principles, difficulty chanting, difficulty with something else. We don't know why these difficulties are there. You know, who knows? Somebody can't get up in the morning, just can't get up. Maybe that devotee is in Maya, maybe has a tumor growing on his brain. I've seen that happen. Devotee just couldn't get up anymore. And it was a tumor on his brain. So there's something called the benefit of the doubt. We take the liberal attitude. We give the benefit of the doubt. Oh, this is a sincere person, has a little difficulty. Instead of, this person's a rascal. That was so rarely done by Prabhupada. So rare. So the attitude is to just be as liberal as possible, be as compassionate, but at the same time protect other devotees if a person is presenting philosophical conclusions that are wrong, presenting mismanaging in terrible ways. But that's why every leader has a leader above them, and every GBC man has a body above them, because every one of us can sometimes get a little bewildered, and we need, as the Beatles song says, a little help from our friends. So we'll stop here. Bali Maharaj he needed help, got the blessings of the demigods. Indra needed help, and there was his guru said, there's no other thing you can do, and the only way you can get help is approach the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and with your prayers, get him to come. So he got a little help from his friends that way. With that, we'll stop here, and in the remaining minutes, are there any questions, comments, reflections?
Thank you, Brahmatita Prabhu. You packed up so many insights in such a short time. It was very practically helpful and sobering also to understand how things are like dealt by Srila Prabhupada. So thank you very much for taking this angle and presenting this.
We asked for the name of the class that we're supposed to give a name. The name of this class is A Little Help from His Friends.
Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody have any comments they'd wish to say? Any words of wisdom besides let it be? Today's Beatles Day, obviously. And anybody have any other reflections in the 1 minute we have left?
Your service is very valuable, Prabhu. In the course of a cooperative effort, there's always some possibility of disagreement and some wrinkle that comes up.
Yeah.
And without that, there's a real interesting quote in the Bible that says, if you have a quarrel with your brother, don't bring your gift to the altar. First go settle the quarrel with your brother and then come to the altar. That Krishna sees this very important, that devotees settle differences. And in our own experience with managing here and there and dealing with so many different situations when conflicts comes up or somebody is pushing the envelope and deviating, our own experiences, like you just mentioned, I always try to get another devotee with me and go and pray to Krishna. Krishna, this is your program. We're here on your behalf. We're your devotees. We don't know what to do. First of all, put it before the Lord. Admit that we don't know what to do, and then say, we'll do whatever you want.
Yeah.
If you want us to be heavy and just throw this person out the window, okay, today. Or if you want us to tolerate this for 100 years. And then it says, and it always, hundreds of situations have come up. And whenever I sit together with another devotee and say, Lord, please show us, we'll do whatever you want, it always settled. It's always settled. And without bringing it before the Lord and without saying, we'll do whatever you want, then it's not very easy to get through some of these things, because these are not chaotic. These are tests coming to us from Krishna to see if we want Krishna's will or the way I think it should be done, you know? And that's what it comes down to. If the way we deal with it pleases Krishna, that's so important.
Yeah, I mean, devotees getting along. We're humans, and humans always have some anartha, and the biggest anartha is envy. And, you know, jealousy means, wow, he got the maha, wish I had it. Envy means, I hope the maha falls on his lap. And, you know, so there's a difference. And Krishna says, Arjuna, I'm telling you all this because you're not envious. So if we're not envious, then we're going to have a liberal heart, and we're going to want to help others, even in their difficult time. The old saying is, a friend in need is a friend indeed. And certainly Prabhupada lived his life that way. And I can be a personal witness to that. Okay, with that, I think we'll stop here. We're greeting the deities. Thank you very much.